All right. Welcome, one and all, to the Green Builder Media Sustainability Symposium 2021 Into the Light. This year's symposium looks a little different than years past, and it's taking place at a slightly later date. But it's National Environmental Education Week, and one thing remains exactly the same: exceptional speakers addressing timely, relevant topics. We're glad you could join us for this all-virtual two-day event. Before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to introduce our sponsor. Drain Technologies is a world leader in creating comfortable, sustainable, and efficient environments. With a bold set of 2030 sustainability commitments, Drain Technologies is challenging the status quo and taking decisive action now to create a sustainable future where communities thrive, where equality is foundational, and where the environment is protected for future generations. We thank them for their participation. And now, here to deliver a few opening remarks from her house to yours is the CEO of Green Builder Media, Sarah Gutterman.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today for Into the Light, Green Builder Media's annual Sustainability Symposium. We scheduled this year's event in celebration of Earth Day, a benchmark day that we use to take stock of our progress, rate our successes, and acknowledge our ongoing challenges. If I'm honest with myself, I have to admit that this year, I'm simultaneously terrified and hopeful. On one hand, and I'll start with the dramatic, extreme weather events are intensifying faster than scientific models predicted, propelling us into uncharted territory. As each year passes, we see more temperature, fire, flooding, and superstorm records broken. In fact, the benchmarks that climate scientists have predicted for 2030, 2040, 2050, and beyond are actually happening now. The result? We see towns from coast to coast charred by wildfire, flooded by superstorms, or drowned by rising sea levels. And entire neighborhoods on the front lines, many of which are disadvantaged, are being forced to make heartbreaking and life-altering decisions about whether to rebuild or abandon the communities that they love. The relentless ferocity of these catastrophic natural events can wear us down and take a toll on our collective spirit. While the staggering level of post-disaster human anguish may not be calculable, the financial costs certainly are. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, estimates that the US economy has incurred nearly $2 trillion in losses from natural disasters since 1980, and that number is growing at an alarming rate. Moving forward, policymakers, local governments, and ordinary citizens will be forced to make agonizing decisions in the race to climate mitigation. The nimble cities and communities that demonstrate the ability to adapt and solve for climate risks will attract the jobs and the factories of the future, while those that drag their feet will be left behind. With all of that said, there is good news. The ever-accelerating pace of initiatives to address our climate emergency on a local, state, national, and even international scale makes me hopeful that we are undergoing a metamorphosis from which will emerge a sustainable, socially just, carbon-free economy. Not only is our current administration aggressively pushing for the adoption of renewable energy, electric vehicles, innovative carbon capture technologies, energy efficiency, resilient infrastructure, sustainable water policies, and many other climate action imperatives on the domestic front, we're also reclaiming a leadership position on the international stage. In fact, just this past weekend, the US and China, the world's two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, agreed to work together to tackle global climate change by maintaining and even strengthening the goals established in the Paris Agreement. And the administration is negotiating similar collaborations with countries like Japan, South Korea, and Canada to bolster emission reduction targets. The private sector is flexing its environmental muscles as well, calling for doubling down on our climate efforts immediately. Last week, more than 300 businesses, including Goliaths as diverse as Apple, Walmart, McDonald's, and Starbucks, joined forces to sign an open letter calling on the Biden administration to reduce US greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by the end of this decade and to achieve net zero by 2050. An ambitious endeavor, no doubt, but one that is in line with what the United Nations and National Academies of Science insist is necessary to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, and declaring the maturation and legitimacy of the intersection of economic prosperity and environmental stewardship. Fortunately, we have a clear roadmap to get there: driving renewable energy adoption, electrifying transportation, reimagining industrial and manufacturing activities, primarily for highly intensive categories like cement, steel, chemical, and paper, transitioning homes and buildings to net zero and all electric, transforming agricultural practices, and restoring and protecting habitats and ecosystems. Make no mistake, we have reached a pivotal, defining moment. It's up to us to decide whether it becomes an awakening or an opportunity lost. We are, all of us, responsible for the shaping of our society. Will we choose to continue to prop up an obsolete status quo that perpetuates social, environmental, and economic injustice, a state of normal that never deserved to work? Perhaps it's time to embrace the spark of clarity that accompanies calamity so that we can rewrite our collective story. What would our world look like if we replaced fear, animosity, ruinous growth, and consumption with justice, equality, empathy, sustainability, compassion, and abundance? We are indeed undergoing an endurance test. That's why it's more important than ever to speak loudly and to think boldly. We must march every day for the things that we believe in. The next era in America and across the globe is unfolding before our very eyes. And what awaits us looks very different than anything we have experienced before. To be sure, there is no return to normal. Like the caterpillar and the butterfly, the process of transformation is both cathartic and beautiful. Our impending metamorphosis will, at times, be painful and confusing, but it is inevitable, and it is time. Time to reorder our world. Time to embrace diversity as a pathway to innovation, resilience, healing, and renewal. Time to recraft a system that facilitates social, economic, and environmental sustainability. To learn more about how we do that, I'd like to introduce you to our first presenter. Dr. Michael Mann is the Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State. He is the author of several books, including his most recent work, The New Climate War, which he'll talk about today, which shows how fossil fuel companies have waged a 30-year campaign to delay climate action, and offers a battle plan for how we can save the planet. So with no further delay, please take it away, Dr. Mann.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah, both for the kind words, the kind introduction, and the important work that you and Green Builder are doing. The work couldn't be more important at this particular juncture, where, as you alluded to, we have a great challenge to avert catastrophic climate change impacts. We are already seeing the damaging and dangerous impacts of climate change. So there is great urgency in acting now, but there is also, as I like to say, agency. It is not too late for us to solve this problem. And on this Earth Day Eve, during an Earth Week, where we are seeing the world's countries come together here in the United States, the US, once again having reasserted leadership on the defining challenge of our time, the climate crisis, and not a moment too late, but we are now starting to see the sort of action that so many have worked towards for decades. And there's reason for cautious optimism that we can rise to the challenge. And so really what I'm going to talk about here in the sort of the nature of this book, the new climate war, is that, you know, some of the old tactics among climate change contrarians, deniers, inactivists, as I call them, the forces of inaction, as the impacts of climate change become so obvious to the person on the street that it isn't credible to deny them anymore, we are still seeing a whole new set of tactics, often more insidious tactics by the forces of inaction in their effort to delay action. And so we need to learn how to recognize them, how to fight back against them, because they are the only thing now that stands in our path. So let me start out by talking about the basic science here, the climate projections. Now, I could show you the latest climate models and what they predict, but I think it's actually more informative to look at a 1982 internal report from ExxonMobil, the world's largest fossil fuel company. It's a report that was leaked some years ago. And in that report, in the early 1980s, Exxon's own climate scientists were talking about the potential threat of climate change. In fact, they made projections that are, it's almost chilling in their accuracy. This is decades ago. They predicted both the increase in warming that we would see and the rise in CO2 concentrations, in the concentration of carbon pollution, carbon dioxide. What's remarkable about the latter prediction is they were only able to predict where we would be today, which is almost 420 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. Pre-industrial levels were about 280. We're already at about 420, and they were able to predict that because they were able to predict the success of their efforts and the efforts by other fossil fuel companies and those promoting their agenda, conservative media outlets, politicians promoting their agenda, the effort to prevent us from transitioning off fossil fuels. Thanks to their efforts, we have now reached a level of CO2 in the atmosphere unprecedented in millions of years. And we've seen the very warming that their own scientists predicted we would see as a result. Now, in that same report, their scientists referred to the potential impacts of this business as usual burning of fossil fuels as potentially catastrophic. That's not Al Gore, that's not Greenpeace, that's not climate scientists. Those are the scientists at ExxonMobil back in the early 1980s. Now, ExxonMobil got rid of that division. They didn't come forward with what they had found, what their own scientists had found. Instead, they attacked other scientists who were reaching the very same conclusions that their own scientists had reached. And they doubled down in a campaign of deceit and disinformation to confuse the public and the policymakers about the threat that we face. Now, if we had acted 2 decades ago, when we already knew we had a crisis on our hands, it would have been fairly straightforward. It would have been much easier to bring those carbon emissions down in time to avert a catastrophic warming of 1.5 Celsius, roughly 3 degrees Fahrenheit. But what decades of inaction, thanks in large part to ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel companies, what that inaction has bought us is what is now a much steeper descent. We have to bring those carbon emissions down far more dramatically because of decades of inaction. As Sarah alluded to, we've got to bring them down by a factor of 2 within the next decade if we're to avert catastrophic warming of the planet of more than 1.5 C, 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And the impacts of climate change, as she pointed out, they're not subtle anymore. We see them play out in real time on our television screens, in our newspaper headlines, in our social media feeds, in the form of unprecedented heat waves here in the United States, in Europe. Last year, this year, the hottest temperature ever reliably recorded on the planet was last summer in Death Valley, 130 degrees Fahrenheit. You take heat, you combine it with drought, it's not rocket science. You get wildfires. You get bigger wildfires, hotter burning wildfires that spread faster, that cover more area, that do more damage, that cost more to our economy, and that result in more fatalities. And that's what we've seen in California, in the Western US. Last summer, California, Washington, Oregon, all the way to Colorado, unprecedented wildfires burning as we make the planet hotter and we make our summers in these mid-latitude regions drier. Now, it isn't just the US. I spent a sabbatical last year in Sydney, Australia, during what came to be known as the Black Summer. It was an unprecedented summer for Australia of heat and drought, and you guessed it, wildfires, they call them bushfires down there, that blanketed the continent. And many of you have seen the images that are seared in our consciousness, these horrifying images as this disaster played out in real time. I literally watched it from the front lines down there as this played out. That was last year, unprecedented heat and drought and wildfires. Now, some of you may have seen this video just a few weeks ago. And no, that's not your imagination. That's a house floating down a river in the same state, New South Wales, where I was doing that sabbatical a year ago. Unprecedented heat and drought and wildfire one year, unprecedented flooding events the next year. It's not like we didn't predict this. We predicted this decades ago, and we reiterate these findings. Just a month ago, my co-authors and I published an article in one of the Nature journals demonstrating, using the latest climate model simulations, that this is something that we really expect to see. Larger extremes on both sides of the spectrum, be it heat, drought, and wildfire, or unprecedented flooding. That's something we expect to see in many of the regions of the world, including Sydney, Australia, including California. And we see the same thing. Unprecedented wildfires one year that destroy the vegetation, destabilize the topsoil. Then you get those winter storms coming in, and those winter storms produce more rainfall because the atmosphere is warmer, and a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, so that when it does rain, you get more extreme rainfall events. And those climate-wrought disasters of wildfire and flooding merge to yield, for example, deadly mudslides like we've been reading about. Well, and then an unprecedented storm season this last year that we actually predicted. Our group here at Penn State made the most accurate prediction, and it's because the main feature in our prediction is how warm those ocean temperatures are in the tropical Atlantic. And when those ocean temperatures increase, you get more active hurricane seasons. This image, perhaps better than any other, really encapsulated these competing climate-wrought disasters that are now playing out. Hurricane Epsilon, we got well into the Greek alphabet, 30 named storms in a single season. We've never seen that before. So here we are in late October, we're well into the Greek alphabet, and this Hurricane Epsilon, you might see, has a brownish fringe at the upper part of the satellite image. That's wildfire smoke being entrained from the the Colorado wildfires that were burning at that time. So here you see these two climate-related extreme weather events merging in a single satellite image that captures the profound impact that climate change is now having. It is for these reasons that I and other scientists have said, you know, the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We're seeing them. We're seeing dangerous climate change. We're seeing damaging climate-wrought disasters. This is the face of climate change. It's not far off. It's not polar bears up in the Arctic or penguins down in Antarctica. It's unprecedented extreme weather events that are impacting us where we live today in a very material way. And that's just a little more than 1 degree warming, 1 degree Celsius warming. Imagine what 4 degrees Celsius, 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet gives us. That's our future if we fail to act, if we fail to change the practices that are causing this increase in carbon pollution, the warming of the planet, the drying of our continents, and all of the other impacts of climate change. Now, for decades, those of us, climate scientists like myself, found ourselves under attack by the forces of denial and delay that I talked about before, the forces of inaction, fossil fuel groups, those promoting their agenda, conservative media outlets, conservative politicians that do the bidding of the fossil fuel industry in their effort to discredit the evidence that climate change is real and a problem. And I found myself in the center of those climate wars decades ago when my co-authors and I published the now iconic hockey stick curve. It really demonstrated the profound impact that we are now having on our climate. And so I have found myself in the past in interesting situations. I'm going to play for you a couple clips here. The first is from a committee hearing of the House Science Committee back in March 2017. At the time, Republicans controlled the House of Representatives. The chair of that committee, Lamar Smith, was a well-known climate change denier from Texas, one of the largest recipients of fossil fuel money in the US Congress. He used, or many would argue, abused his authority as the chair of this influential committee, the Science Committee of our government, of our House of Representatives, to call into question the basic scientific evidence for climate change. He had been engaged in efforts to defund climate science while he was the chair of that committee. He actually even tried to launch criminal investigations into climate scientists that he accused of promoting fraudulent research. And I'll play you a clip here from that hearing. I was the sole witness for the minority, the Democrats. There were 2 other witnesses invited by the Republicans. And here I'm addressing Lamar Smith directly.
According to an article that came out a few days ago in the journal Science, Chairman Smith was on record at the Heartland Institute. This is a climate change denying Koch brothers funded outlet that has a climate change denier conference every year. And Chairman Smith spoke at that conference.
Dr. Mann, don't mischaracterize that.
Well, let me finish my.
No, they do not say that they are deniers, and you should not say that they are either.
Well, we can have that discussion. I'd be happy to. Let me finish my
be
statement.
accurate in your description.
I stand by my statement, but can I finish my point?
I'd like to reclaim my time.
Yes. So he indicated at this conference that he, according to Science, and I'm quoting from them, he sees his role in this committee as a tool to advance his political agenda rather than a forum to examine important issues facing the U.S. research community. As a scientist, I find that deeply disturbing.
Dr. Mann, who said that?
This is according to Science Magazine, one of the most respected outlets. And
who are they quoting?
This is the author, Jeffrey Mervis, who wrote that article. I'd be happy to send to committee the article.
That is not known as an objective writer or magazine.
Well, it's Science Magazine.
Yeah,
So there you have it. You can't make this stuff up. It was the chair of the House Science Committee dismissing our most respected science magazine, Science Journal, one of the 2 leading science journals in the world, along with Nature and Science, accusing science of not being an objective source, which sort of tells you something about the up is down, black is white world of climate change denial that we faced in years past. I'll play one more clip. This is from a national television program that I appeared on in Australia, again, as those record wildfires, those bushfires were playing out, and I was part of a panel discussion about the wildfires, along with some other figures, including a conservative member of parliament, a conservative senator, who, as we'll see, insists that he's trying to keep an open mind about the science.
You said you get information across your desk every day,
Yes.
which leads you to doubt or be open-minded about the science.
I am
What is that
open-minded about it.
information?
Oh, it's a range of information which goes. It's a range of. Thank you.
But, sorry,
It's-
could we
it's-
just respectfully listen to this?
Yeah,
minute?
thank
I'm just
you.
trying to get to the bottom of this. What is the evidence that you are relying on?
I'm not relying on evidence, Hamish. I am saying.
You said it. You said it. But you said it.
But this is why my mind is open. I would love to be convinced one way or the other, but to be prudent, what the government is doing is it's got a climate and emissions reduction policy, and it is a good policy, and it will mitigate risk to the maximum that it can. And where risk cannot be mitigated, it will adapt. And that's what we've got to work on is the adaptation.
Yeah, come on now, mate.
And he's an American.
Now, you should keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out.
Well, and I have plenty more of it. Of course, that's a quote that was used by the great Carl Sagan to point out, the irony of often those who claim to have an open mind are in fact simply filtering out that information that doesn't conform to their ideological beliefs. So, we have seen denialist politicians in the United States, here in the US, down in Australia, but by and large, that's gone away. Denialism doesn't really play anymore with the public when they can see the impacts playing out in real time. And so that old climate war is coming to an end. The assault on the basic scientific evidence is coming to an end, but it doesn't mean that the forces of inaction, the inactivists, have given up. Far from it. What they've done is to engage in an insidious array of new tactics or alternative tactics in their effort to prevent us from moving on, in their effort to prevent us from moving away from our reliance on fossil fuels. And those tactics include soft denial, not literally denying that the planet is warming up, but denying that it's a problem. And you have figures like Bjorn Lomborg, who calls himself the skeptical environmentalist, but he's really neither. True skepticism in science is equal-sided. It doesn't mean the indiscriminate rejection of science that you don't like. And Bjorn Lomborg brandishes a Greenpeace T-shirt to prove his environmental bona fides while he does the bidding of the fossil fuel industry and appears on conservative media outlets denying that climate change is a problem. False Alarm is his most recent book, which was reviewed, by the way. Bjorn Lomborg claims to be an economist. It doesn't really have a record of publication in the field of economics, but his book was reviewed by the New York Times by a Nobel Prize winning economist, Joseph Stiglitz. And I'll just read his summary comment here. This book proves the aphorism that a little knowledge is dangerous. It's nominally about air pollution. It's really about mind pollution. And it isn't just Bjorn Lomborg. Other protagonists have emerged to fill that space. Now that hardcore denial isn't tenable, the new denial is this softer form of denialism. It's an overblown problem. We don't really have to worry about it. And we see that promoted in, for example, the Murdoch media, the Australian in this case. Or delay. So we've got soft denial, and we're going to see an alliteration here. A lot of words that begin with D. Delay is the next of them. Okay, well, maybe it's real and it does represent a challenge, but we can just adapt to it, says Marco Rubio from the state of Florida. I guess what he means is that his fellow Floridians can simply grow gills and fins to deal with the inundation of their coast by rising waters from global sea level rise. Or Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, who loves to talk about resilience and adaptation and innovation. Now, these are all good words. These are all good things, but often they're used in an empty manner, that it's empty rhetoric that hides an agenda of inaction. We just need to be more resilient. We just need to adapt. We'll just let the market innovate to sort it out. Anything but solve this problem systemically, which means getting off fossil fuels. That's inconvenient to the fossil fuel interests whose bidding Scott Morrison, the Conservative Prime Minister of Australia, has done during his reign as Prime Minister in Australia. Or we can just simply intervene in some other manner with our global environment, shoot particles into the stratosphere to try to block out some of the incoming sunlight. What could possibly go wrong? One might reasonably ask. It's not, surprising that the former CEO of ExxonMobil, the world's largest fossil fuel company, loves this idea. It's just a geoengineering problem. We'll just engineer our way out of it. We'll put particles into the stratosphere. We'll dump iron into the ocean. We'll suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. This promise of all of these things that we will do that we can't do now, but we can promise to do decades from now. It's a very useful crutch for those who don't want us to take action now. Don't worry, we'll have a simple techno fix for you if you just wait. So let us continue to extract and sell and burn those fossil fuels. And it isn't just Rex Tillerson. Bill Gates has a book out on climate change. He has been an advocate of geoengineering, and in large part because he downplays the role that renewable energy can play in meeting our needs in the decades ahead, in decarbonizing our civilization. And in downplaying the role that renewable energy can play, he ends up promoting riskier strategies to addressing the climate crisis. And geoengineering is one of them. It comes with what I call great moral, the term is, now I'm forgetting the term, but it's a moral peril, which is the idea that we have a solution that we can deploy in the future, using that as an argument for not decarbonizing our economy as quickly as we can now, ends up providing an excuse for polluters to continue with business as usual. The idea that there's this simple techno fix down the road. It's called moral hazard. And it's one of the several reasons that we shouldn't think of geoengineering as a safe solution to the climate crisis. By the way, tomorrow on Earth Day, I have an op-ed coming out in The Guardian, which talks about the peril of pursuing this strategy of geoengineering with the one planet that we have. The idea that we will interfere at a global scale in an unprecedented manner with a system we don't understand perfectly is not a safe path forward. There is a safe path forward, and that's stopping the burning of fossil fuels. But another one of these new climate war tactics. So again, there's delay, there's soft denial, there's delay, there's deflection. We don't need systemic solutions. We don't need carbon pricing or subsidizing renewable energy or preventing the construction of additional fossil fuel infrastructure. All things that only our government can do. We can't do these things ourselves, these policies, these systemic changes. So the argument, the deflection argument, is we don't need to do that. It's just a matter of you and me being better stewards of the environment. And it's an old tactic. Some of you may have grown up with this commercial. I did. The so-called crying Indian commercial in the early 1970s with the tearful Native American. He was tearful because he was, as he canoed down this river, he saw a polluted countryside littered with bottle and can waste. And the tagline of the commercial, people start pollution, people can stop it. It felt very empowering think I was 5 or 6 years old at the time I first saw this commercial, and it certainly empowered me. We need to do something about this problem. Felt good. It was a feel-good message. It drew, by the way, upon sort of the zeitgeist of the time, the sort of almost mythical role that Native American culture took on in our social discourse at that time, and that powerfulness was seized by those who produced this public service announcement. Well, it turns out we'd all been had. This was a PR campaign launched on Madison Avenue by Coca-Cola and other beverage companies who didn't want to see bottle bills pass in states like Massachusetts, where I grew up. This would be a systemic policy solution that would deal with the problem of increasing bottle and can litter systemically, but it would hurt their bottom line. It would hurt their profits because they would have to process those returned bottles and cans. So instead, they funded millions of dollar ad campaign to convince us that we didn't need bottle bills. We didn't need systemic solutions. It was just a matter of you and me being better citizens. A classic deflection campaign, and it was very successful. Decades later, thanks to the success of this deflection campaign, there is no national bottle bill. There are only 13 states that have bottle bills. They were very successful. And one of our other global environmental threats today is, of course, the global plastic pollution crisis. And we can thank the beverage industry and their deflection campaign for that crisis. Well, the fossil fuel industry is nothing if not studious, and they've studied the past playbooks, the playbooks of the tobacco industry, the playbooks of the beverage industry, and they're using that deflection campaign very effectively today. And even mainstream media outlets like the New York Times play right into it, blanketing the pages of their newspaper with all these articles about what we can do to solve the climate problem, or by changing our diet, by not flying anymore. And of course, a lot of these things are good things. They're things we should do. There are lots of changes we can make in our lives that decrease our environmental footprint and our carbon footprint, and they save us money, and they make us healthier, and they make us feel better about ourselves, and they set a good example for other people. But we can't allow for the framing that this is the solution, that this is all we need to do. And it's often used as a crutch, once again, to draw attention away from systemic policies, carbon pricing, subsidies for renewables, things that'll solve this problem at its source. It's a very clever way of deflecting attention, and people of goodwill get taken in. Even mainstream media outlets like the New York Times and many others, as I said, have really been taken in by this. It's not a mystery why British Petroleum, BP, gave us the first carbon footprint calculator, the first individual carbon footprint calculator in the early 2000s, because British Petroleum and other fossil fuel companies wanted us so focused on our own individual carbon footprint that we failed to notice theirs. 70% of global carbon emissions are from 100 polluters, 100 polluting companies. So deflection, another classic new climate war tactic that's been very effective. And then finally, well, not finally, go on, now deflection, now we've got division. Hey, well, if you can get people arguing with each other about their individual carbon footprint, get us fighting with each other about whether we're vegan or not, or whether we fly or not, it's a wonderful way to divide a movement, and it's being used. And this, along with other tactics, are being used to divide climate advocates so that we don't speak with one voice demanding action, demanding change. So it deflects attention away from systemic solutions. That's a win for the fossil fuel industry, for the forces of inaction. It divides the community. That's a win. And what else? It is very useful as a means of discrediting some of our key opinion leaders. And it isn't a mystery why the Murdoch media and the Murdoch media empire has been perhaps the most influential and powerful proponent of climate change denialism and climate change inaction in the world. And right now in Australia, they're talking about what could be done to basically rein in the misinformation and the disinformation of the Murdoch media. And we're starting to talk about that here in the US as well. And so they have spent the last several weeks, of course, trying to tar John Kerry, our special envoy on climate. If they can discredit him as a hypocrite because he still uses air travel, then maybe we shouldn't listen to him. We shouldn't take him seriously. And they've used this tactic against thought leaders, opinion leaders in the environmental space, like my friend Leonardo DiCaprio or Al Gore. So it's a threefer: deflects attention, divides the community, discredits some of our key messengers who are advocating change. And they continue to go after John Kerry, of course, with this sort of attack. There are other ways that they divide us. Every once in a while, you'll get a gift. The inactivists will get a gift. And the most recent one was in the form of Michael Moore's latest film. Liberal icon Michael Moore created a film, Planet of the Humans, which is a full frontal assault on renewable energy, on the primary solution to the climate crisis. And why he did that, we may never know. What drove him to produce this extremely misleading polemic that grossly distorts the environmental impact of renewable energy in an effort to discredit it? What drove Michael Moore to do that, we may never know. But we can certainly see who was promoting that film. It couldn't get even a mainstream distributor. He ended up publishing it on YouTube. The movie appeared on YouTube. And environmentalists panned the film, the extremely misleading film. Mainstream media outlets panned the film. Rolling Stone, Vox, my own op-ed in Newsweek, criticizing the very misleading effort. Who is promoting it? Fossil fuel front groups like the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a Koch brothers front group, the Heartland Institute, another Koch brothers front group. Breitbart News, they all loved this film. And the Murdoch media ate it up. Oh, they loved the division, the divisiveness that came out of this conflict between liberal icon Michael Moore and the environmental community. It was a gift from heaven to the inactivists. Then finally, and I want to wrap it up here soon, doomism. It's the last of the D words. Look, if they can convince us it's too late to do anything about the problem, then ironically, that potentially leads us down the same path of inaction as outright denial. And they don't care about the path we take. They just care about the destination. They don't care if you give up because you think climate change is a hoax or because you think it's too late to do anything about it. And the science says it isn't too late to do anything about it. And yet you have narratives that are often premised on distortions of the science that are as misleading as the distortions of the science by climate change deniers. And these narratives are used in a very, in a very unconstructive way, in a way that disempowers us, that ironically marshals some of the same people who would be on the front lines advocating for change. It marshals them, it weaponizes them for the forces of inaction by leading them to disengagement. And there are a lot of people, good intentions, good-hearted people who have fallen into despair and doomism, who are victims of this very misleading framing. And we have to help them out of that stage. We have to help them understand that it isn't too late to do anything and take them out of that category of disengaged into the category of engaged. It's important to rescue our friends and our colleagues who have have fallen into despair based on the false premise that it's too late to do anything about the problem. It's not. So how do we win the war? Well, as I said before, it's about urgency and agency. Yes, we have to act now. No, it's not too late to act. And no, Bill Gates, we don't need a miracle. We don't need a technological miracle. We already have the technology necessary to solve this problem. Studies out of Stanford, Berkeley over the past couple of years have shown we can actually meet those goals, 80% renewable energy by the end of this decade, 100% of energy generated from renewables by mid-century. We can do that with existing technology. We don't need new technology. We don't need a miracle, Bill Gates. We just need the political willpower, the political will to act. And I thought it was telling in an interview a couple of weeks ago. And look, I'm happy that Bill Gates is using his platform to try to bring awareness to the climate crisis, but his prescription is the wrong one. And when he was asked about it, he said, well, I don't know the solution to the politics of this issue. If you don't know the solution to the politics, then you don't know the solution to the problem, because it isn't technological. It's simply a matter of political willpower. And again, recognizing those obstacles that are being thrown in our path by the forces of inaction and pushing them away. And yes, we've already heard there are reasons for cautious optimism. I'm inspired by the work that this organization, that Green Builder Media, is doing to raise awareness about the importance of the the buildings, the both industrial and domestic building sector, which accounts, if you add up the carbon generated by construction, which is a little over 6%, and the electricity and heat used by buildings, residential homes. You add it together, you got 12% here, plus 6.4%, 18.4%. That's a larger piece of the pie than transportation, than vehicles. So it's really important. The work that you're doing is really important. There's no magic bullet. We have to decarbonize every sector of our economy if we are to meet this challenge. And the building sector is increasingly an important one to focus on. And that's why I'm so thankful for the work that this organization is doing and the work that all of you watching are doing in helping us address the climate crisis by decarbonizing this key sector. So we know the solutions, we know what we need to do, and there's some good news. Global carbon emissions flatlined in 2019. And in fact, in the power sector, they came down for the first time in decades. And we know why they came down. The transition that's underway from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. It's happening. Problem is, it's not happening fast enough yet for us to avert catastrophic warming. And there's some good news. Renewable energy capacity, we're breaking new records in the US, down in Australia, South Australia in particular, where they're showing you can do it. We don't need future technology. We've got the technology now. Existing energy storage combined with wind and solar and geothermal. We can do it. And we know we can do it because we saw global carbon emissions at their peak. They came down 17% last March. By year end, the average for last year was a 6 to 7% fall in global carbon emissions. Now, if we can keep that up year after year for the next 10 years, we remain on that path to limiting warming below that catastrophic level of 3 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the good news. The bad news is we're not going to get 7% reduction in carbon emissions year after year simply from temporary changes in lifestyle, lockdown policies, social distancing, decreased transportation during the pandemic. And this is something I pointed out at the time. And lo and behold, here's a headline from just the other day, yesterday. We're likely to see a 5% rise in global CO2 emissions this year. So they're coming back. Now, that doesn't mean they're coming back to where they were. It's a rebound from last year's 6 to 7% decrease. So a 5% rise still means a net decrease. We're not going to undo the decrease in carbon emissions from last year. We're still on a path to decarbonize the economy, but temporary policies like we have seen during the era of the pandemic alone aren't going to get us where we need to go. We need systemic changes. We need new leadership here in the United States, and we've got it in the form of the Biden administration. came forward with an array of executive actions that collectively comprise the boldest actions we've ever seen from an American president, surprising even some of Joe Biden's critics from the progressive left who didn't think that he was really committed to acting on the climate crisis. I think he's proven the critics wrong. And so we've seen this very bold agenda, first 100 days from the administration. Again, we heard at the very beginning some of the developments just this week. This monumental agreement between the world's two largest emitters of carbon, the US, which is the largest historical emitter of carbon pollution, and China, which is today the largest emitter of carbon pollution. And as goes the US and China from a diplomatic standpoint, likely goes the rest of the world. This sends a message going into this climate summit tomorrow here in the US held by the Biden administration that we are ready. The US is back. We're ready to lead on this issue. And that's putting other actors, it's putting some pressure on them. In fact, just yesterday, Biden announced our new commitment under the Paris Accords going into this meeting. The US is committed, we heard this at the very beginning, to having, not having, owning, but having, cutting in half greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That's the path I said we need to get onto if we're going to avert catastrophic warming. And that's the path that the US has said it is taking. And that's putting pressure on some other intransigent actors. Australia, we need to bring them along. We need to bring along Brazil. We need to bring along other petrostates like Saudi Arabia and Russia. But this is really a shockwave now as we go into the serious proceedings in the lead up ultimately to the next conference of the parties, the next major climate conference in Glasgow at the end of this year. There's reason for cautious optimism. And more than anything, my optimism when it comes to tackling the climate crisis really comes from our children, from the youth climate movement, Greta Thunberg, who we've all heard about, but many others who are leading this movement, which is collectively recentering this issue where it always needed to be. For too long, we allowed it to be about science, economics, policy, and politics. But what's it really about? It's about ethics, our ethical obligation to those who had the least role in creating the problem and are most likely to bear the consequences, our obligation not to degrade the planet for our children and grandchildren. And I think that has created an environment where we can make some real progress now in the years ahead in tackling the defining crisis of our time. So I will leave it there with that message. Let that be our legacy. Let our legacy be that we recognized the problem in time, we acted, and we left behind a livable planet for our children and grandchildren. And I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mann. Really appreciate your time. And I do have a couple of questions lined up for you, if you don't mind.
Please.
The first one comes in from Sheila. She wanted to know, where does the funding come from to make this sort of sea change necessary?
Yeah, so thanks, Sheila. It's a really good question, and it gets at the misleading framing we often encounter, you know, in our media and certainly among climate and activists when it comes to the climate crisis. You hear claims, oh, it's going to be so expensive. You know, it's going to be really expensive failing to act. It's already leading to billions of dollars, a record number of billion or more dollar natural disasters. In fact, we can't even call them natural disasters. They're being exacerbated by climate change. Every year, hundreds of billions of dollars, by some measure, globally more than $1 trillion a year because of climate change caused disasters, extreme weather disasters, inundation from sea level rise, the devastation from record heat. It's costing us far more than it would cost to actually do something about the problem. In fact, what we increasingly understand is that there are far more potential jobs in addressing the climate crisis than in remaining addicted to fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry has become largely automated. There just aren't that many jobs right now in that industry. There are a lot of, you know, coal and oil and natural gas barons making a lot of money, but there aren't actually that many jobs anymore for the people. And we've seen a death spiral in coal during the Trump era. Was that because of Trump's war on coal? No, it was because that is a structural shift. We're getting away from that. The great economic revolution of this century is the green energy revolution. And those countries that get on board are the ones that are going to prosper in the future. And the US recognizes that now. That is recognized by the Biden administration. And in fact, you've probably heard his refrain, during the election. When Donald Trump talks about climate change, he talks about a hoax. When I talk about climate change, I talk about jobs, because there are far more jobs in addressing the climate crisis. And one of the programs that, one of these executive actions that was announced a couple months ago by Biden, one of the programs is a civilian climate corps that'll put people to work in those transitioning communities where workers have been displaced by a collapsing fossil fuel industry, put them to work cleaning up the brownfields and the old leaky wells and remediating the environmental damage that's been done by decades of exploitation of dirty energy. Let's put those people to work. Let's provide jobs for people who can help solve this problem and provide a more hospitable environment rather than jobs that lead to the degradation of our environment. It's win-win. And that's really important to understand when you encounter that fallacious claim that it's a choice between the economy and acting on the climate crisis. Look, as I like to say, there is no economy on a dead planet.
We have one more question, if you don't mind, Dr. Mann. What role do you see young people, and I think specifically young voters, playing in all of this? You alluded to some of the youth movement towards the end of your presentation, but can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks. Another great question. It's so important for everybody to be engaged in all the ways that we can be engaged. But one of the most important ways to engage is, of course, voting, because we get the politicians we vote for. And elections have consequences. We saw that when young voters turn out, and they turned out in this last presidential election in near record numbers, as I understand it. And they voted on climate because among young voters, climate change was, I believe, the most significant voting issue for them. So these people came out, they voted on climate, and lo and behold, we got a president who doesn't deny climate change, wants to lead on climate. And we got, although by the barest of margins, a Democratic Congress that might be able to actually pass some climate legislation that will complement the work being done by the administration through executive actions. And so it's so important for young people to be engaged. When they sit out elections, that's when we get climate change denying Congress people and presidents. When young voters come out and vote, and they vote on the climate issue, then we get climate leaders who are willing to represent our interests rather than the interests of the polluting industries who too often fund political campaigns. And so the youth are an inspiration to me, both for their activism on climate and the fact that despite all of the cynical claims that, that the youth of today are inactive, they're politically, that they're politically inactive, they're not engaged in our political discourse. We saw them turn out when an issue that was of great importance to them was on the line. And one of those issues, of course, was climate change. And so we need that engagement. We need to keep it. It can't just be the presidential elections. It's got to be the off-term and midterm elections. We need young people to come out and vote. We need everybody to come out and vote, and to vote on the climate issue, because otherwise we lose all those gains that we got during, say, a favorable presidential cycle, and we see those policies as quickly as they can be put in place, they can be undone. So our job isn't over, and especially for young voters, you've got to continue to use your voice in every way possible and turn out in every single election and vote all the way from president down to dog catcher. It really matters.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mann, for your time today. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing, information. It's just phenomenal. And it's, to our audience, it's not every day you get the chance to hear from someone that helps shape the conversation on world climate policy. So, Dr. Mann, it was quite an honor. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you so much. It was my pleasure. And thanks for the great work that you folks all do. Just, this is our moment. Keep it up. We're going to do it.
Great, thank you. Our next presenter is the Managing Director for Obvious Ventures. That's where Andrew Beebe brings a lifelong passion for building companies around sustainable systems and people power. For nearly 2 decades, Andrew has focused on clean technology and clean energy solutions. He started down the clean tech path with Energy Innovations in 2003, which he grew from a business plan all the way to a major solar developer, serving customers like Google, Disney, Sony Pictures, and British Telecom. After selling the company to Suntech in 2008, Andrew served as its Chief Commercial Officer, as well as Vice President of Global Product Strategy. During his tenure, Suntech became the largest solar company in the world. After leaving Suntech, Andrew spent 2 years as Vice President of Distributed Generation for NextEra Energy, the largest clean energy developer in the US. And now I want to pass things off to Sarah Gutterman to moderate our next session. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Gutterman, CEO of Green Builder Media. Welcome to the Sustainability Symposium 2021 Into the Light session with venture capitalist Andrew Beebe. Andrew is a VC with Obvious Ventures, but one of the things I like best about Andrew is that he was an entrepreneur for about 20 years and created companies that were simultaneously profitable and sustainable. He participated in Internet 1.0 as well as Clean Tech 1.0. And now he's taking us into the next iterations of both of those. So with no further ado, I'm going to kick it off to you, Andrew, and please take it away. We're really eager to hear from you and see your vision for the future.
Great. Sarah, thank you so much. Great to see you again, even from a distance. And great to be coming into the light with all the participants at this year's symposium. I was with you a couple of years ago in Las Vegas. It feels like eons ago, but I'm so happy to see that you and the movement are continuing. So thank you very much for everything that you've done. Sarah asked me to come today to talk a little bit about Obvious Ventures, about how we see the world evolving over the next decade and some of the opportunities that are being driven out of the pressing crises that we face around climate. So I thought I'd start off with just a little bit about us. We were founded in 2014, now 7 years ago, with a really clear but simple vision of trying to reimagine the global economy through a world positive lens, trying to use business to transform trillion-dollar industries in ways that we all would like to see the world evolve. Trying to find purpose-driven founders who have great ideas that are looking at massive industries and trying to take them to new levels. We've now done that across 3 funds, over $600 million under management, and we have 85 or 83 companies in the portfolio today. Those companies are divided into 3 pillars. This is how we started the fund in 2014, and this is what we've done with each of our funds subsequent to that initial fund. The 3 areas are people power, healthy living, and sustainable systems. In people power, we invest in companies like Gusto. Maybe many of you who run small and medium businesses use Gusto as your HR platform. Companies like Medium. Maybe many of you, I know Sarah's published on Medium and use that as a platform to get messages out and to do writing of all types. And that's sort of the people power bucket, looking at the future of work, the future of media, and the future of education. Healthy living is companies like Virta Health, reversing type 2 diabetes without insulin. Beyond Meat, the now famous burger company, but when we first invested, a really sort of progressive, wacky idea to reimagine what plant-based protein could really taste like. And the next version of that, Miyoko's Kitchen, which is really a vegan cheese company, a vegan dairy company that is in cheeses, butters, and new things yet to come in that category. So that's healthy living. I spend most of my time in sustainable systems. Sustainable systems is our pillar used to describe categories around the future of mobility, the future of building systems, and the future of energy and climate. And that's what I want to talk about today. Today, we're going to discuss something that's been on my mind for the last year, trying to look back at my experiences over the last 15 years in the climate and clean tech space, and understand that while we're in a little bit of a moment right now, I wanted to dissect and try and understand, is it really a different kind of moment? Is there something special happening here so that we're not just doomed to repeat some of the ups and downs of the past? I think that we've entered this climate decade, and I think a lot of people have recognized it, and it's pretty exciting. It's different for a bunch of reasons, and I want to talk about them. But I think that the primary difference this time is that now we have no choice. I can bore you with a bunch of statistics. I think everybody in the room or the virtual room here probably knows it, but I think this is a use it or lose it moment for opportunity. We have to take this next decade to transform our economy, every single corner of our economy, as we've done before with digitization and other massive transformations, and make sure that we have a resilient, sustainable, anti-fragile future at the end of it. So I thought first we would just review the last decade. I feel like I can speak with some modicum of experience in this sort of historical look back, because I was there, I'm not going to say in the beginning, but in the early days of at least the latest incarnation. In 2002, I had just finished running a really exciting and dynamic early stage internet 1.0 company called bigstep.com in the Bay Area. We help small businesses get up and running on the internet, and I loved it. We were venture backed, great co-founders, built a great organization, award-winning product, but ultimately sold the business. And I decided at that point that I wanted to try and take that entrepreneurial spirit and direct it towards something that was going to make a massive difference for the future every single day. And I turned my attention to climate change, or just clean tech, as we would call it back then. Al Gore's movie hadn't come out. I think climate change was probably like a thermostat setting. You know, it wasn't a thing in 2002. So this was early days. And the chart on the right here, talking about the electricity prices of electricity from different sources, that super steep one from solar goes back to 1970. And as you can imagine, that chart went way up and to the left. And that was, I entered, you know, in 10 years before this chart started, and it was still way up and to the left, about another 10x higher. So it was a daunting concept that we would be able to use technology, not lab dollars, not government money, and not nonprofits, but use economic incentive to help people transform our economy to a cleaner energy economy. And, you know, this got me in the New York Times, as the image shows here. It got a lot of people in the New York Times. It got a lot of excitement. And before I knew it, there was sort of an exciting bubble taking shape. I had recognized it a little bit from my time in the internet bubble, but I didn't realize quite how quickly it could rise and how quickly it could burst. So I think it's worth looking back at that period of 2008, 2009, or really that whole decade, and asking the question, why is that not going to repeat? So I've got a long a list of a couple of things I want to share about why it's not going to repeat, and then talk about where we think things might go from there. And the first is about corporate responsibility and consumer demand. I have been blown away. I mean, you know, one of the marvels of the internet is the ability to transparently see information. If you know, today we have ingredient labels in America. That's great. You can look at the back of a packaged good and figure out what you're actually eating. But it used to be that there was a lot of chemistry and long words that you didn't understand, and it looked like you were reading German or something. Now with the internet, you can look those words up. You can start to understand what's in what we're putting into our bodies. You can even start to understand who's behind the things that you're putting into your bodies. You can understand who owns that juice company? Is it really owned by a sugar water company? And you can start to see a little bit more transparently how the world works. And I think that's led to consumer behavior where, once you know something, it's hard to unknow it. And I think consumers, once they were empowered with that ability, decided to use it, and they decided to demand more of the providers of their goods and services. And that meant pushing them to be more responsible as corporate citizens. They were not simply saying, I want to buy the best tasting product. They were saying that company's behavior is a reflection of my relationship with them when I give them money. And therefore, I expect more from them. And it took a while, but I think ultimately companies listened. Companies are also run by human beings. And I think a lot of them, especially leaders, really understood that they had a responsibility themselves. Maybe it was their children. I hear that often from executives. Their kids or their grandkids were the ones who really, they jokingly say at first, guilted them into understanding the impacts of climate. But ultimately, I think they realized that this was a great way to do something good for the planet. And it turned out that their consumers and now shareholders were excited about it. So very differently than a decade ago, we're seeing a massive push at the corporate level to play a role in this transformation. And I'm sure everyone has seen the numbers, but it started with a lot of commitments from corporations. Google was an industry leader. My solar company in 2006 built Google's corporate headquarters solar array. It was 2 megawatts. And at the time, literally at the time, it was the largest corporate installation in the world. Now it sounds like a backyard array on a big house, but they took a leadership position, and then they shared that information with Walmart and others. And those companies, again, once they came to understand it, they couldn't take that back. They couldn't put it back in the box. And instead, they went on their own journey to green their operations. And now more and more, we're seeing them move up the food chain, green their supply chain, et cetera. And those dollars are huge. When they make commitments to green their supply chain, when they talk about going carbon neutral or carbon negative, and then they explain that they're going to be reporting on it on a quarterly basis, these are massive shifts. FedEx just made an announcement that they're going to be net carbon neutral, I believe, by 2040. And by 2030, all of their ground vehicles, new ground vehicles, will be electric in the fleet. Those are extraordinary commitments that have real dollars behind them. And that's something that's quite different than, with the exception of outliers like Google, that's quite different than 10 years ago or 12 years ago. So one of the things that I'm really excited about is the corporate and consumer demand really leading the way. So another piece that I made reference to earlier is just the extraordinary, and some would say unpredicted or unpredictable drop in costs of renewable power and increase in performance. So these charts are a little bit of an eyesore, but what is just so fun about them, this is the International Energy Agency, literally the organization globally whose job it is to tell us where costs of energy are going. Each one of these lines represents a year at which they started to make projections about the cost of renewable energy into the future. And as you can see at the bottom, those early years, they were projecting that renewable energy would just sort of flatten out in terms of its cost projections, and instead, and therefore have very, very low penetration. And then instead, over time, each year, the penetration and because the cost and performance got better and better, the penetration got higher and higher. And literally every single year they've had to revise upward. And as you can see on the right, they were so far off. I think they may have just stopped trying to do the projections, but it is amazing to me that they are still relied on for these kinds of numbers. And perhaps, maybe to be generous, it just shows you how hard it was to project exactly how quickly these costs could drop. It was an exciting time to be part of that. And when we look back and ask the question, hey, there was a clean tech bubble back then, did anything actually get accomplished? This is a big part of what got accomplished, both for solar and wind. And there were many other areas where cost quietly in the background, and sometimes without the backing of venture capitalists, costs were plummeting. And that had a massive impact on what happened. this is now underway again and again in different categories. So in batteries today, I think many charts like this exist, where over the last decade, people forecasted what would the price of a lithium ion battery ultimately become. And many people said it just can't get below $300 a kilowatt hour. It can't get below these thresholds. It can't get this much higher in density. And every single time we've blown through those numbers, and we're now approaching $100 a kilowatt hour for lithium ion batteries. And those are the kinds of staggering numbers where entire industries get transformed. One of those industries that's going to get transformed or is being transformed is automotive and mobility. So this is another chart that if we wanted, we could go down the path of looking at the cost of electric vehicles. And just like the cost of renewable power, they will inexorably become cheaper to build and cheaper to operate ultimately than internal combustion engines. And that will transform that industry as a one-way street. And the money is following. So not only are corporate investors making the investment, consumers spending the money, but investors are out there getting ahead or maybe catching up, but getting ahead of the opportunity in terms of pouring dollars in. This is Larry Fink from BlackRock, but KKR, Wellington Management, mainstream VCs, all of the banks, global pension funds, and on are all jumping in the game. And they're unanimous. They want to green their portfolios, and they want to move to where the puck is going. Again, I think this is a one-way street. I think it would be very difficult for them in 5 years to go back and say, you know what, we've decided to go back to coal and oil and gas. We think that this climate thing was overblown. So Wall Street's showing up now with SPACs and responding to the Tesla effect. And now GM has committed to 100% clean EV vehicles, and Volvo, and I'm sure all of the others will be following suit very, very soon. So these kinds of one-way street projections and commitments are moving massive pieces of money on the board, and it's an exciting time to see it happen. So I talked about consumers and the way that they behave. Another piece of the next generation is not just about spending money, but what younger people want to do. Oil and gas, there have been article after article talking about the oil and gas industry having a really tough time recruiting best and brightest out of top schools or any schools, because those people are much more excited, whether it's being a wind technician, a solar installer, or an executive trying to start the next great startup out in Silicon Valley. They're not focused on those dirty industries of the past. They're focused on the future. And many times they're focused on climate change. The amount of people that we see saying, when I was in high school, I saw the Al Gore slideshow, this guy going around the world with a slideshow and training people to share that vision really had a massive impact on an entire generation, or possibly two. And those people are now taking leadership, or soon to be leadership and training kinds of roles. And I think that too is creating a momentum and wave, the likes of which we didn't get to experience in the first wave of clean tech. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about policy. I mean, there is, I remember clearly in the last wave getting $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion in loan guarantees would be considered an extraordinary accomplishment for an entire industry. And now we're talking about trillions of dollars getting behind various aspects of getting behind a clean economy, whether it's a Green New Deal or just softer policy shifts or EV support or charging station deployment, all of this kind of infrastructure that's going to help us build out a cleaner and greener future. I think the support from Washington has changed substantially. It's very democratically focused, but more and more Republicans are realizing that they've been on the wrong side of history, some of them for a long time, and really want to be part of what's next. There's no reason this has to be a partisan issue. This is absolutely about jobs, and it's absolutely about every corner of the country. There are now many, many more solar employees in America than there are people in the coal industry. And I think when you add up wind and solar, you'll see it bigger than natural gas and coal together. So these are great transformations taking place, and I think they can really benefit all corners of the political spectrum. At the state level, we've been seeing it, regardless of who's in the White House, we've been seeing state after state sign up to really lead the way as well. So at every level and around the world, we're seeing great support on the policy side. So what happens next? I think we've got a great setup here. I really believe things are going to be different this time, and time is of the essence, right? People see that we've really got to get moving much more expeditiously than we have in the past, and a lot of companies have now shown that you can make a lot of money doing this. So I'll just talk about a couple of themes that we're excited about at Obvious. First up, everything electric. Maybe 5 years ago, we met an electric bus company, Proterra, and a lot of people thought, you can barely get a four-wheel passenger vehicle to get to its destination with electricity. How are you going to do that with an electric bus? It just sounded pretty contrarian, but we like things that are contrarian and now in hindsight look quite obvious. And Proterra is exactly that. They are now a national leader in the electric bus transition and moving into things like trucks and other types of vehicles. That's just one example of some, every single internal combustion engine in every single category is going to become electrified. And that transition will take shape in mining and construction and any kind of diesel generator, maritime, and electric flight. We also invested in a company called Lilium. You see one of their vehicles here for electric air taxi. These are cheaper to operate, much more agile, and will transform an industry, not just removing all the carbon, but opening up flight for all sorts of folks who were not able to afford them before, and do it in shorter distances and tighter environments to transform the electricity movement of the future. And then there's other mundane components like charging networks and electric vehicle fleet management, et cetera. There's so much to be done here. Maritime, all of these different aspects of our economy are going to be decarbonized. Some are much harder, like electric long haul flight or long haul trucking or long maritime shipping, long distance shipping. These are all tough categories, but maybe it's hydrogen, maybe it's fuel cells, maybe it's just a breakthrough in the battery world. All of these areas will be electrified and decarbonized. So there's also a lot of fun stuff happening in the financial institutions to help with the decarbonization of the economy. And one of those mechanisms that's getting a lot of attention right now are carbon credits or carbon offsets, renewable energy credits, other types of trading mechanisms to help transform businesses while they move to a truly zero carbon or net negative operations. We're not going to do that overnight. So meantime, we've got to find ways to give people carbon credits that will help them do that. There are a ton of great startups out there transforming and trying to invigorate this industry with technology. And that might mean satellite monitoring of rainforests to make sure that we are allowing for reforestation, that we don't, we're not selling carbon credits for some great park that we're going to hold on to for 100 years while we're secretly cutting it down for cattle grazing. It might mean forests across America reforesting with companies like Drone Seed that are seeding after forest fires or reforesting areas that have been cut down for grazing or other kind of livestock. There's so many different opportunities there. We're excited about a few things in that department, and I think you're going to see a lot of fun startups that can move very, very quickly and are all software driven. These don't have to be big capital expense kind of businesses. And then there's capital expense kind of businesses across the categories. We think construction is in the midst of a massive transformation, both digitizing, where it has become sort of come late to the party in becoming much more digital in the way people work, both on construction sites, but in preparation, and then in the operations of buildings, but then also in the materials that are being used. So this is an image from Plant Prefab, one of our portfolio companies that focuses on building sustainable net zero homes in a factory and delivering them on site, dropping them into place. This allows for much, much quicker and much more sustainable building practices with much less waste. So this is an area that we're very excited about. We think there's a lot more to do here as well. This will be a global challenge, so we can make sure that when we're looking at these embodied carbon challenges like concrete, cement, and steel, we're able to find the right way to do that cost effectively and carbon effectively as well. Another area we call the sustainable supply cloud is trying to make supply chains much more efficient, but also much more transparent. So with B2B marketplaces, logistics companies, we're going to see a wholesale transformation there as well. That may just be things like digital brokering, but it also may mean rethinking the use of rail, electrifying rail, rethinking how trucking works, and of course, removing a lot of the carbon intensive components of trucking, port operations, and maritime logistics as well. So that's just a sort of a tour de force of exciting areas that we believe are going to be substantially impacted during this climate decade ahead. There are many other areas of interest to us as well, but I think the key message here is 20 years ago when I first made that commitment to become a climate focused entrepreneur, the category didn't even really exist. I think now we are retiring entire concepts like renewable energy is almost redundant. We're just focused on energy. Of course, it's all going to be renewable. I think we're going to get to a stage 10 years from now where electric vehicles will also be redundant because they'll all be electric. And you can go down the list and all of these words that we put together will just become part of the fabric of everything that we do. So every single part of our global economy is about to be transformed, and all of it will need big companies, government, nonprofits, and great entrepreneurship. And I hope everyone here who's listening will be part of that journey. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I always love listening to you because I always learn something. And as a recovered venture capitalist myself, I can say that you are literally one of my favorite VCs. First of all, just because you're a nice guy, but also because you have this wonderful vision and you just make these concepts that could seem lofty and like so ambitious that they're out of reach, very tangible and logical. So thank you so much. That was really interesting. Of course, I have a bunch of questions.
Great, fire away.
All right. So first of all, you started about, the climate decade and why is this different? And your first point was about corporate and consumer involvement and demand. So kind of a market push and pull dynamic. Where those vectors are kind of joining to create a tour de force or a synergy that's larger than kind of the sum of its parts. And so one of the terms that I've been seeing lately, with respect to corporate commitments, obviously we've seen a lot of companies commit to going, net zero or climate neutral, but now I'm starting to see the term climate positive. That, and that's embracing a little bit more of a regenerative mindset. Are you familiar with that term? And if so, Can you talk a little bit about some of the companies that are making climate positive commitments and what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Microsoft has been at the forefront of articulating, just using a lot of data to clearly articulate what their current carbon burn rate is in a lot of ways, and then track back their deficit spending over the last couple of decades and commit to reversing all of that. And to do that, you've got to do a bunch of climate positive things. You've got to really be able to give back to the ecosystem from a climate standpoint and from a carbon standpoint. So I think, the most promising near-term stuff that we see is a lot of natural carbon sink solutions that are out there. Sylvia Terra is a very interesting startup, working on the reforest, either protecting forests, but also working on reforesting. And if we can use some of those natural tools, I think we're going to find ways to create carbon sinks. And a lot of companies are going to be investing in those. I personally invested in a great company called Running Tides Technology in Portland, Maine, started by a Dartmouth engineer who is mechanically using robotics and very cool mechanical tools to make kelp farming much more cost effective, and using that kelp farming or seaweed farming for as a carbon sink. A lot of people believe that the ocean will be one of the, if we can turn on some of the catalysts, it'd be an even better carbon sink than it already is. So those are the types of tools that I think people are going to look at investing in to make sure that they can be carbon positive in their operations.
Excellent, thank you. Your second point under kind of understanding why the climate decade right now is different had to do with cost and performance. And as you indicated, batteries are kind of the bottleneck right now with respect to massive adoption of solar and wind and renewable energy. Clearly there are a lot of different players that are trying to capture market share and really help to drive down the pricing of batteries so that we kind of get to that price parity or even cost benefit that we're at right now with PVs. Everyone from China, the Chinese government, trying to really put their flag in the ground with respect to leadership in the battery space, to a lot of the oil and gas companies, Shell buying Sonnen. We're also starting to see large PV manufacturers like Jinko coming out with storage solutions, and Enphase coming out with a new storage solution. So can you talk a little bit more about what that particular segment looks like? Who wins?
Yeah.
And what how does that play out?
Yeah, and Tesla needs to be mentioned there as well, right? Doing some extraordinary things even recently in Texas, sort of stealthily building out a massive, effectively peaker plant there with batteries. I guess I think that the simple answer is I don't really know. We have spent a lot of time looking at and not investing in new battery chemistries and new battery technologies. I tend to believe that I wrote a piece a long time ago called "Lithium is the New Silicon." Like, I tend to believe that we already have systems in place that are going to make this work. So people used to talk about scarcity of materials for solar and say that we've got all sorts of challenges ahead for the solar industry and we can never break through these cost items because it will just be too expensive to source this material or turn it into polycrystalline, and China is going to hoard all of the materials and supply and create constraints, and that never materialized. Lithium is different, and nickel and cobalt are real, and there are supply constraints there. But I think we're going to see a lot of the same players around the world, and much of that could come from Asia, but a lot of it could be in the United States, regardless of who owns it. I think we're going to see them successfully getting through some of those cost barriers, and then we'll see interesting and perhaps novel innovation. Lithium ion is not the best battery technology in the world. It's just the one that's been scaling the most, just like polycrystalline was with solar panels. Not the best technology, just happened to scale, and that manufacturing learning curve of something like 20 to 30% cost reduction with every doubling of cumulative production, that really works, and it's a real thing. And I think that's happening to lithium ion batteries now. So we'll see who wins on the production side. I think we as recipients of it, and industries like automotive, are going to absolutely be winning on the consumption side.
Agreed, thank you. All right, so your third point was follow the money. And clearly we are seeing you talked about Larry Finsk. We have seen all kinds of investors start making commitments to putting money into climate solutions, and companies and technologies that blend sustainability with social justice and economic vitality and prosperity. At what point do you think that investors will shift from, kind of making commitments and investing in solutions to actually, more punitive measures where they're actually withholding money from kind of non-climate solutions? At what point do we see that pivot?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do think you can easily make the case that that's already happened. In Europe, for sure, we have entire, the Danish national oil and gas company, Dong, they transformed themselves, rebranded, and sold off all of their oil and gas assets. They were just trying to get ahead of it, right? I mean, maybe they were thinking this is just the right thing to do. I think they were also thinking we better get out of this asset pretty darn quick. It's done really well for us for 150 years. It's time to move on. And I think we're seeing that with pension funds. We're seeing that with some university endowments where they are saying we are actually in a divestment mode. But those are probably the exception, especially in North America, than the rule rather than the rule. It's definitely true that they are shifting, and when you shift your allocation from a dirtier industry to a newer and cleaner one, it is a reallocation. So I think in some, like it's happening a little bit, but whether they are going to say we never again will, that I think in large part we have yet to see that movement. What I have found is that managers, people who limited partners who invest in us, they have outside of their venture portfolio, they have been investing in public markets in some small amounts in ESG ETFs and in some renewable and clean ETFs or bundles of stock. And those things have done incredibly well. And their more traditional peers have been missing out on that and been laggards, particularly over the last couple of years where the oil majors really tanked. And so that alone, that delta of people who are going clean and green and looking to the future are just making a lot more money. I think that helps with the reallocation. Those numbers could bounce back and forth for a little bit of time. So mandates might be another effective method, but I think their shareholders and stakeholders are starting to push them to just make that reallocation shift happen.
Great, thank you. Your fourth point was about the next generation, and this is something that is really near and dear to our hearts at Green Builder Media. We've been tracking millennials and older Gen Zs for many years, but especially over the past year as they have become the top influencers in the housing market, spending more money in on buying and remodeling homes than any other audience segment. And we absolutely agree. In all of our research and on all of our engagement, we see that this is a very mission-driven, kind of purpose and values-based audience segment, and they are willing to spend more for organic food or natural products or just a more sustainable, efficient, healthier home. How do you think that? Well, let me ask you this: is that audience segment impacting your decisions as an investor, as a venture capitalist? And if so, how? And how, just in general, do you think that manufacturers and even policymakers are responding to this shifting and transforming set of consumer needs and expectations?
Yeah, it is 100% informing our investment decisions. We invest in food and consumer packaged goods, and like Beyond Meat and Miyoko's Creamery, but Urban Remedy, and in California, Good Eggs, which is a wholesome food delivery company, mobile grocery company. And these businesses are just, I think, a natural evolution to a cleaner and healthier way to live. So as consumers, we're watching them very carefully and obviously really thrilled about how they are demanding the change. I think another thing I would say about that generation is that they're now in the workforce and they are now moving up the ranks. And they have the same demands there too. And labor markets have been, except in the middle of last year, for those employees, the labor markets have been tight. And in a responsive environment where you have to work to keep your employees, listening to them on those levels is really important. And they are all looking for values alignment, not just in what they buy, but in where they work. And that goes to the construction foreman who wants a digital device that allows them to see right into the BIM model and whatever, but they also want to feel good about the kinds of homes and buildings that they're building and the way that they're impacting the natural environment around them, all the way up to hotshot MBAs who say, I want to go start something, but I want it to matter. I want it to matter to the world and to the future. And I think that is, I just haven't seen unanimity of that kind of zeitgeist across generations for some time. So it's exciting to see.
That's fun for me to hear you say, because that was me at one point, that hotshot MBA that wanted to go start a company that would change the world.
And you did it.
It's been a very long and circuitous journey, a wild ride, but I agree with you that there's just so many kind of eager folks in that age group that it's just creating this massive change. Your last point was about policy and regulation. And what type of national policy, this may be kind of a trite or silly question, but what kind of national policy do you feel like we just have to get in place right away?
Yeah, I mean, before I answer that, I would just say, like, if we have learned nothing in the last 60 days, like the power of getting the right people into the right roles in Washington is just so profound. Jennifer Granholm running the Department of Energy, just a perfect fit. Mayor Pete for transportation. These are just really very qualified, exceptionally smart people who are now going to be in control of large budgets and big decisions. Same with the military and the way that the government thinks about procurement. So there are, like, on a policy or regulatory basis, just procurement alone is going to have a massive impact on the way that we think about spending. I'm hopeful that U.S. Postal Service will change their tune a little bit and get more electrified faster versus what they just announced recently. But I think if I were to wave a magic wand at a national level, I think probably the easiest thing to do is set some national standards around, well, not easiest, most important would be a price on carbon that has a mechanism around it. So we've set a social price on carbon recently, but I think turning that into either a cap and trade or a tax and trade solution is going to make a lot of sense, and we're going to do it eventually, so we might as well just get that ramped up now. So that would be a magic wand moment. I think renewable energy standards, possibly, we've done such a good job at the state level, I'm not as worried about that, but doing something nationally or at least regionally from a national perspective could be very valuable there as well. And then there's a lot of tax policy, rebates on tax rebates on wind and solar could easily be turned into rebates, not credits, as a mechanism. And then electric vehicle rebates, not credits, could be very helpful as well to help just promote that transition faster.
Great, thank you. All right, and my last question is, you talked about electrifying everything and the decarbonization economy and building better in supply chain, but is there one particular technology or even company that you have your eye on that you would deem is going to be the most impactful or just is the most exciting that you're watching right now?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, right? We've invested in 82 companies, but one a category that we often talk about, like what is the not obvious thing? What is the thing that people make fun of us for and we remain really excited about despite it? I think that electric flight is an extraordinary moment in history as we start to see that take off, as it were. I mean, that's just going to be a lot of fun, and I think it's going to change things substantially. I think there's still not a full understanding of how much lower cost operations are when you go to an electrified environment. In almost every category, it's just much cheaper to operate these things and maintain them. That's true on the ground with four wheels. It's true in flight as well. And as the European and American aviation agencies start to approve these vehicles, I think we're just going to see some just really, people are going to be blown away at how well they can work and what it can mean for the way that we move around the world and do so cost effectively. This is not about billionaires jetting off to the mountains. This is about everyday people finding ways to live farther out from cities or get away for those weekend trips that might otherwise be really challenging in a 5-hour car ride and the like.
So does a company like Lilium solve for that with the shorter haul, shorter distance flights, or is that a Virgin, kind of international over the seas, over the pond type of flight, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, I think, in the near term, I think it's the shorter haul vehicles. Electric flight in long distances is going to be really tough for a while. I think there's an interesting company, Universal Hydrogen. We're not investors, but they're working on different types of propulsion systems that are electric, but maybe, as the name would imply, use hydrogen and other solutions. But in the near term, I think it's going to be more about the 100, 150 mile journeys, or 75 to 150 mile journeys that allow people not Fifth Element like flying around amongst tall buildings in New York City, but really going from Brooklyn out to Pennsylvania and getting out of town and out of the region, and even doing that on a daily basis. It should be that cost effective over time.
Wonderful. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. As always, this has been fascinating and enlightening. Always great to check in with you. And thank you so much for sharing your insights and your optimism today.
Thanks for having me. Great to see you from a distance.
All right. Take care. Stay safe and healthy.
All right. Our final guest of day one is the Senior Counsel for the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, leading the committee's work to advance adaptation, resilience, and preparedness, including the wider adoption and enforcement of codes and standards to advance sustainability and reduce loss of life and property. Samantha Medlock led development of the Climate Crisis Action Plan for Congress on climate science, resilience, public health, national security, and financial risk. She joined the committee from a private sector role in climate risk management, insurance, and finance. Previously, Sam was senior advisor in the Obama White House, coordinating across the executive office of the president and the administration to reduce the risks and costs of climate change and disasters. She has more than 25 years of experience in environmental, land use, and disaster law and policy, supporting governments, business leaders, and public-private partnerships. Joining us from Washington, D.C., please welcome Samantha Medlock.
Thanks very much, Mike, and big thanks to the Green Builder team for convening this important discussion. The climate crisis presents existential threats to U.S. communities, to key economic sectors, which must adapt in order to respond to needs, to remain viable, and to thrive in the new normal. While the challenges are daunting, there are vast opportunities to deliver innovative solutions and products that respond to those needs and also address the disproportionate impacts of the injustices of pollution, the climate crisis, and disinvestment. So our planet is at a major crossroads, and unless global leaders put us on a path to net zero emissions by the end of the century, we will all face escalating impacts that don't know national or local borders, including rising seas, devastating wildfires, worsening droughts, and climate-fueled storms. That's why this week, as President Biden welcomes leaders from around the world and across business sectors to his Leaders Summit on Climate, I am also more hopeful than ever that America can lead again on climate action. And together we can make progress on an emergency that's hurting families and workers around the world with escalating costs for everyone. And one of the ways that we do that is through harnessing American ingenuity and innovation. Just as past presidents led our allies through major global crises, President Biden is poised to build a new era of American leadership to guide the rest of the world in an equitable, and resilient clean energy future with good paying jobs and technological innovation. We are strongest when we harness all of our scientific knowledge and our can-do spirit to inspire other nations. So as we work together to tackle a global crisis, we can also benefit from the tremendous upsides in health and well-being for American families and workers, and for our businesses that are delivering innovative new products and services. President Biden has already shown his deep commitment to solving the climate crisis. On his first days in office, he took immediate action to bring the United States back into the Paris Agreement. His next steps, including the Leaders Summit, his announcement of the nationally determined contributions, and a renewed commitment to the Global Clean Climate Fund, will signal how far we can go in the near term and in the decades ahead. In Congress, we are already working to enact the President's Build Back agenda, which gives us this once in a lifetime opportunity to rebuild our homes, our public buildings, our infrastructure, decarbonize our economy, and secure environmental justice. So a bit about the House Select Committee. We issued our Climate Crisis Action Plan as a comprehensive blueprint for congressional action that is informed by input from a wide range of stakeholders, including leaders in business, elected officials, tribal leaders, climate scientists and public health advocates, youth activists, and individuals that are representing communities on the front lines of climate change. Our report and recommendations aim to reduce emissions and advance resilience, build high quality jobs, and address the disproportionate impacts of pollution, of underinvestment and disasters on low-income households, communities of color and tribal nations, and indigenous communities. And in this effort, special attention has to be given to workers, to families and communities that are being impacted by the effects of climate change, but also by the transition to a clean energy economy. So in my remarks, you're going to hear some consistent themes emerge around that intentionality, that focus on people, that focus on where the opportunities for a resilient, sustainable clean energy revolution begin, which is often not here in Washington. So we look at all the ways that we can be influencing the development and deployment of strong science, translating that into good codes and standards, and making sure that the solutions are available for all. So we call on federal action in our Climate Crisis Action Plan to develop actionable climate risk information and tools that local leaders need to be making informed decisions about where and how to build and rebuild. We call for robust investment in our nation's infrastructure, housing, and important buildings like schools and hospitals. And we recognize that local leaders also need sustained and skilled technical assistance to be assessing their risks and evaluating their options and designing solutions with meaningful collaboration with neighborhoods and business leaders. We're going to be hearing over the coming days specific examples where US communities have not spent the last 4 years waiting for leadership, but for the better part of the last 5 to 10 years have been advancing local initiatives, working across local boundaries on regional action. And now is the opportunity that we have to match the leadership that we're seeing from local leaders, and doing that here in Washington. Both Democrats and Republicans agree that we need to put folks back to work, and we have to better prepare communities for extreme weather events. There was more than ample warning, for example, in the Southern Plains, for the winter storm that devastated nearly the entire state of Texas, paralyzing those communities and affecting people in their homes. And so President Biden and the Congress are united in an all of government approach against those kinds of impacts. and embedding climate and justice policies as part of a national recovery. So making smart investments now in resilience and clean energy will pump money and jobs back into the economy, but also help to respond to the threats that are already sufficiently well understood to act. I want to spend some time talking with you all more specifically about codes and standards that need to be used to inform the siting and the design of the built environment, and to be thinking about also where we rebuild and how we rebuild following disasters. Too often, federal policy does not reflect the integrated approaches that state and local governments use on the ground. We will see, for example, adaptation and resilience addressed in one part of federal law, with clean energy and decarbonization addressed in entirely separate efforts. One of the opportunities that we see through the leadership of this White House and the work we're doing here in Congress is to advance an integrated climate agenda that leverages opportunities to decarbonize while building resilience. Decarbonizing buildings presents both a substantial economic opportunity as well as a complex challenge. Across the nation, there are roughly 125 million homes, 5 million commercial buildings. They vary widely in age, in structure, and efficiency. They use an enormous amount of electricity. They are responsible for approximately 3/4 of US electricity sales and two-fifths of our energy use. So at the same time, retrofitting existing buildings is a significant opportunity to create great local jobs while also reducing emissions and energy bills and reducing the vulnerability of the built environment to disasters. In 2019, the energy efficiency industry employed more than 2 million Americans and was poised to grow another 3% in 2020. However, economic impacts from the pandemic did result in job losses of more than 400,000 energy efficiency jobs in March and April of 2020 alone. So we in Congress are looking at opportunities to address that as part of the recovery. We can put millions of Americans to work, reduce our energy costs, and increase resilience for families and businesses, and significantly reduce carbon pollution by supporting building resilience and decarbonization as part of the economic recovery today and for decades to come. To decarbonize the sector, the US needs to ensure that all new buildings are as clean as possible, from the energy used to heat the buildings to the materials of the buildings themselves, but also retrofit existing buildings to make them more efficient and resilient. So there are many different dispersed decision makers that are responsible in that process. The federal government engages with the greatest impact through incentives, through standards setting, through technical assistance, and through our convening power. So for example, building codes may dictate the types of minimum requirements for the construction of new buildings, including their efficiency and how they're going to perform against different stressors, such as extreme wind or flood or wildfire. And while the federal government is involved in the consensus process of creating new model codes, at the end of the day, state and local governments, tribes, and territories decide which codes and standards to adopt based on their specific circumstances. So this is where the federal government can be involved, both in that standard setting process, as well as the development through R&D investments of innovative approaches, analyzing those codes and standards to ensure that they're going to be efficient, they're going to be accessible, they're going to drive an affordable outcome and product, but also in providing technical assistance to local leaders to help them make those decisions. So the recommendations of the Climate Crisis Action Plan, as well as the leadership from President Biden, are providing those financial incentives and technical support to help local jurisdictions, help markets move, and help individuals make their buildings cleaner and more resilient. After all, the greenest building is the one that does not become storm debris in a landfill. So in addition to the calls for reducing emissions and advancing renewables, we call for specific actions to ensure that federally supported buildings and infrastructure will last their intended life. For example, we call for the nation's resilience to flood to be strengthened by updating flood resilience standards to more accurately reflect current and future conditions and better align federal flood standards to those that are already used by state and local governments that have long recognized that current federal minimum approaches that date back to the Carter administration are not sufficient against rising seas, against stronger storms, and extreme precipitation events. So we look at our own building footprint, making sure that we're leading by example in the things that are in federal portfolios, but we also call for government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie and Freddie to look for ways to secure all federal loans and loan guarantees with insurance against flood, and call for the disclosure of these kinds of hazards for properties for sale or lease, including what those insurance requirements are going to be, the claims history on these structures, and any known history of damage. We also call for preparedness against longer and hotter wildfire seasons by improving mapping of fire-prone areas, reducing wildland fuels that can threaten communities, and increasing federal support for community planning, technical assistance, and wildfire risk mitigation. This includes advancing the adoption and use of the International WUI code. This is the code for the Wildland Urban Interface, to include more fire-resistant community design and materials and landscaping for defensible space. We also look for incentives with the beyond code approaches, for example, those that are promulgated by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety called Fortified. The American Jobs Plan that the President has advanced is well aligned to the Select Committee's Climate Crisis Action Plan. It calls that every dollar spent on rebuilding infrastructure should be driving energy efficient and resilient outcomes. It increases the resilience of critical infrastructure and essential services, for example, with the electric grid, with food systems, with community health and hospitals. And we see that intentionality in the American Jobs Plan as well to help communities rebuild to stronger codes and standards, while also setting aside the benefits that can be targeted toward our environmental justice communities and those that are on the front lines. I want to also talk with you a bit about making sure that the work that we're doing here in Washington advances U.S. leadership in critical technologies and America's research infrastructure, and working to reduce the inequities in R&D and STEM. So where we see the American Jobs Plan call for a new technology directorate in the National Science Foundation, and that focus on fields, including advanced energy technologies that can collaborate and build on existing programs across the government. This is where the American Jobs Plan and the work of the Select Committee and our colleagues across the Congress could be advancing R&D where those recommendations align. We are also calling for upgrades to existing research infrastructure and laboratories across the country, whether it's the brick and mortar of those facilities, but also the computing capability and the strength, resilience, and security of those networks. We are aligned in calls for dedicated funding to historically Black colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions, and helping those institutions act as research collaborators and providing opportunities like graduate fellowships and pre-college programs for underserved populations. So together, those investments in R&D serve to advance the Climate Crisis Action Plan recommendations and the American Jobs Plan to support a technological revolution to drive deep decarbonization and U.S. competitiveness, to strengthen climate science, and ensure diverse participation of research, design, development, and demonstration programs. I want to reserve time for some Q&A, so I really want to bring it to a close there, although there's, of course, a lot more to be said about the ways that we can be advancing these goals. But in closing, I'll note that clean energy and resilience present some of the best opportunities in recent history to transform our world for the better. That's why we are seeing important progress in the private sector. We're hearing about this at the Sustainability Symposium already, including crucial clean energy investments and commitments from business leaders, from utilities. The threats posed by the climate crisis is matched only by the potential of the global clean energy economy to deliver progress. And as President Biden meets with global leaders this week, he's bringing the US to its rightful place on the world stage. So we're excited in the Congress to work to embed that in legislation, in law, in policy and practice. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I really look forward to getting into a dialogue with you all in the time that we have left this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Samantha. Really appreciate it. You know, I did have a question for you, and I want to make sure our audience knows that they can submit questions via the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. You know, I was reading recently about the headwinds that the Biden administration and really all our diplomats are currently facing in regards to the longevity of our climate commitments, especially given the last administration. How does the administration dissuade those concerns when it's very obvious that we have federal elections every 2 years?
Right. It's a great question and a very timely one, of course. We are you know, seeing the opportunities that are available to us today where the Congress, the administration, many state and local leaders, many business leaders are aligned. And I would emphasize that so much of this does also have great bipartisan potential, and we see robust leadership from Republicans at every level of government. And so I think that there's every reason to be optimistic that the policies that are being set in place today do have longevity. Having said that, we also see some whiplash happening, right? As revocations of Obama era policies are part of the change in administration. That's why in Congress we are working to identify every opportunity to align in bipartisan action, but also working to embed in durable law and policy the kinds of initiatives that we see the president lifting up right now. You know, an important example would be in the areas of flood or wildfire resilience. It is very important for President Biden to articulate that direction to agencies and departments across the federal government through executive action like executive orders. However, it's also important for Congress to be embedding those types of approaches to resilience as well as clean energy in law so that it can have that durability and that sustained progress. But you're asking the right question. The other thing that I think is really encouraging is that while federal leadership is absolutely important, and we see that, and it's very encouraging, we're also seeing state and local governments that are not waiting and are embedding in their own local practices durable policies that reflect local priorities and the local culture. And a clean energy, resilient, justice and equity revolution that is very much happening at the grassroots. So I hope that folks will take that as encouraging, but a lot of that federal durability and policy and practice is going to be coming through what we get enacted and get to the president's desk.
So I asked about durability. Sarah's got a question about credibility. How do we regain the trust on the international stage with respect to our climate and policy action promises, given that we did lose quite a bit of trust and credibility when we walked away from the Kyoto Protocol and we temporarily walked away from the Paris Accord.
Right. You know, I think that world leaders recognize and see, not just in the United States, the ebb and flow that can happen with changes at the very top. But I think first and foremost, there needs to be a sustained arc over time that demonstrates the commitment to US leadership on the world stage. I think that we're going to see a lot of that this week. We already see that with the announcements that are coming through and the commitments that we see coming through the White House, but also across the world stage this week. And I don't want to get out ahead of what some of those announcements will be, but of course we're all staying tuned. But what we're already seeing get released is very exciting, and I hope goes a long way toward demonstrating that commitment and that credibility. But it really must first begin with America leading by example. We rebuild our reputation, not by the things we say, but by the things that we do, not by the commitments that we articulate, but by the commitments that we fulfill. And so that's where I think it's a very important time now for Congress to be enacting the legislation that is needed to change authorities and breathe life into those commitments.
Final question for you, Samantha, and we appreciate you joining us today. It's a question that's very similar to what I asked Dr. Mann. What role do you see young voters playing in this? Because to me, as somebody outside the Beltway, I feel like there's this tidal wave that's starting to come. That's all these young voters, as they're reaching 18 and they're getting active prior to voting age, but it just feels like they are extremely motivated to make the change happen. Is there a sense within the Beltway too that there's this wave of young voters coming over the next 2 to 4 years that could really transform the way that we develop policy?
No question about it. I've been in this work for my entire adult life. I won't say precisely how long. It's more than 30 years. And having worked at every level of government across different sectors, coming to Capitol Hill, I did not anticipate how profound my own work, my views on this work, my day-to-day work would be impacted by the leadership of young people. And that has been probably the single most inspiring, driving, motivating thing. I did not expect it, and it has been the most impactful part of my experience on Capitol Hill. And we take that extremely seriously here in Washington. We view young people as pointing the way forward. They are holding us accountable in the day-to-day. They are demanding action. They are demanding answers, and rightfully so. And we don't ever want to make the mistake of looking at these young leaders to say, my goodness, what a bright future you have ahead of you. You are so talented. Because I can tell you their response is that they don't feel that their future is bright. They are horrified, and rightfully so, because we have compromised their futures in ways that are existential, and they are holding us accountable for it, and rightfully so. So for me, it is with a deep awe and respect that I look to the leadership of young activists and young people. I view my day-to-day work as serving them, and I'm grateful every day for the ways that they are holding us to account. We need that. So I think that is echoing across the halls of Congress, across the administration, and I urge young people every day to stay engaged and to give us not only your passionate view, but to hold us accountable to responding to you. The other thing I would say in closing to the business community is that you need to be paying attention to these folks as well, and making sure that you are designing products and services and innovations that are also responding to what they need. They simply will not tolerate complex contracts or, gotcha types of designs in, I've looked most closely at insurance and financial transactions. Stuff needs to be accessible, it needs to be deployable on a handheld device, and it needs to respond in immediate ways. That's just one example of the kinds of products that young people who are making financial decisions today and will be making the majority of financial decisions tomorrow are expecting of us. I think the same can be said in building design and building innovations. So I hope the business community is paying attention to young people as well, both for the market that they are, but also for the ways that you need to be thinking about attracting talent. They're going to be demanding these kinds of innovations that respond to what they're asking for, also from their future employers. So it's a great time, and I'm super grateful for that question.
Well, I'm not sure how you've been at this for 30 years when you're only 29, Samantha, but we appreciate you. We appreciate you being on here. It's always good to see you. Good to see you again, I should say. It's been a couple of years, but thank you for coming back, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
Always a pleasure. Looking forward to the coming days.
Well, that concludes our program for day one of the Green Builder Media Sustainability Symposium 2021. A big thank you to Dr. Michael Mann, Andrew Beebe, and Samantha Medlock for their presentations and their time. And another thank you to Train Technologies for their generous sponsorship of the symposium. Now, please make sure to join us tomorrow on Earth Day at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for day two. Our featured speakers will include Andrew Winston, Sarah Gutterman, Sam Rashkin, and Jean Myers. We'll wrap up tomorrow's proceedings with a Q&A session. You won't want to miss it. On behalf of Green Builder Media, I'm Michael Ignan. Thank you for attending today. We'll see you tomorrow.